My name is Carol Allis, and I'm author of my latest book, Dearest Anna, a love story, a true story, a family secret, a whispered legend, a trunk full of hidden letters, and a love story buried for almost a century. Before I begin, I want to give a shout out to the History Center of Olmsted County and history centers everywhere. I wouldn't be here. This book would not have been published if it hadn't been for Krista Lewis, the archivist at the Olmsted County History Center. She found a photo of Anna, the first that I had ever seen, and I'll explain that a little bit later, but they're invaluable. The stories contained in those walls and the importance of keeping these records is so important. We have to keep our history centers alive and well. So I have a question for you. What story will be lost if you don't tell it? Every one of you has a story. You have at least one, if not many stories. And we know a lot of the best stories in our families are the stories told over the dinner table and at family reunions and Thanksgiving dinner. And many of them are oral, and we all laugh and or cry or have feelings about them. But it's not where you went to school or where you lived or your address or details like that about your education or your work. It's those little anecdotes and the hidden stories that we all have that are so precious, letters in the attic, as it were. So I want you to think about that as I tell you a little bit about Dearest Anna. Uh, think about those stories that aren't written down anywhere that would be lost if you didn't tell them. So one of my stories was of Anna. Once upon a time, many years ago, before my grandmother, there was Anna. I first heard about Anna when I was about 19. Everyone in the family knew about her. No one dared talk about her in front of my grandmother. That this was the young woman that my grandfather loved and lost before he met my grandmother. In 1894, two people graduated from Rochester High School, my grandfather, Roy Allis, and Anna Luella Barnard. This is the photo that Krista found for us at the History Center. This is my grandfather, Roy, up in the corner. This is Anna, and this is the first time that I ever saw her photo. This was only 2 years ago, and I wept, and I'll tell you more about that later. In 1894, Roy and Anna graduated together and started writing love letters back and forth to each other, over 400 of them, until 1898, when Anna died suddenly and tragically. And the legend in my family was that my grandfather was devastated, and he grieved for her every year on the anniversary of her death, even after he was married to my grandmother. And my father said that your grandmother had to endure that shadow. My grandfather was the most interesting man I ever met. And again, you have someone like this in your family that you need to write about or talk about. He was a colorful figure in Rochester, Minnesota, the home of the Mayo Clinic, and Orinoco, which is a little town about 11 miles north of Rochester. He was followed by the local media, by the Star Tribune, the St. Paul Pioneer Press. He was a very colorful figure in the area. And when he died, the reporter who wrote about him the most in the Rochester Post Bulletin wrote his obituary, and I'll read you just part of it. A friend of mine, Roy Allis, was buried in Orinoco Wednesday, and I shall miss him. He was an articulate and well-read scholar, and many 15-minute visits lasted 2 hours while he settled the problems of the world with some particularly appropriate classical quotation. He was, in the very literal sense of the word, a gentleman, and one of that fast vanishing breed, the true individualist. So I knew my grandfather until I graduated from college, and he died, and this story haunted me for decades. Who was this woman that my grandfather loved so deeply and hid all their letters and grieved for her, even after a 63-year marriage to my grandmother? The letters lay hidden for years with my aunt, actually, and finally, when both my grandparents died, my aunt felt it was safe to bring the letters out of hiding and turn them over to me. And then they languished again for decades while I worked and raised a family. And finally, when I retired in 2013, I was able to get back to them and transcribed all of them. There were over 400. It took me 5 years. And what letters they were. They were young. Roy was a hopeless romantic who was struggling with his studies in school. He went to the U of M, he went to Hamlin. He didn't do very well. It wasn't because he wasn't smart. He just constantly wanted to run off, go to the theater in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And Anna was a studious bookworm. She was fierce and headstrong. She was determined to become a teacher. While Roy hoisted 100-pound bags of grain in his father's mill, which is where he worked in Orinoco during the summer, and killed rats with his bare hands, Anna bore through teachers' college, forged off alone to Cloquet for her first full-time teaching job, and battled recurring illness. The letters were laced with history of social revolution, of the political turmoil in the waning days of the Gilded Age. Their lives were closely entwined with the Mayo brothers and the rise of the Mayo Clinic. At one point, the Mayo brothers had offered my grandfather a job if he finished medical school at the U. Their virtual who's who of Victorian literature. I learned more about literature of the time from these letters than I ever learned from any college course. There was so much history, I ended up working on about 40 pages of endnotes with all the references. But most of all, it's a love story played out in words on paper across the miles. So on June 15th, 1894, Roy Wirt Allis and Anna Luana Barnard graduate from Rochester High School. Anna with honors. And let me grab a picture I have of her when she was young. This is one of the earliest pictures I have of Anna. The story behind this picture is also interesting. And my grandfather, this is my favorite picture, my grandfather rowing on the Zumbro River in Orinoco. A Rochester Post Bulletin newspaper article says, at the graduation, the old man eloquent, an oration by Roy W. Allis, set forth in masterful style, was one of the most pleasing of the evening. Mr. Allis has the power of personal magnetism so essential to a public speaker, unusually well developed for one so young, and will make a record for himself should he enter some profession where he can use his powers to advantage. The last of the graduates to take part in the program was Miss Anna Barnard. She entertained the audience with the class prophecy for the year of 1919. And so began the letters, and I thought I'd read a few of them to you. One of my favorites is one of the first that Roy wrote to Anna. She was off out east visiting her brother. For women to travel alone in those days was quite an adventure, and Anna was up to it. And Roy is at home, and he's lonely for her. Dear sweetheart, this is August 10th, 1894. Here I am again, up on the point, leaning on your seat and thinking of you, with the wind in my face and a storm coming up in the west. I have been at work all the week, pitching bundles for the man I told you of. Thursday evening, I got your letter. It was cold, you remember. And when I came home alone in the evening, we had a fire in the fireplace, and my little sister Mary was lying in front of it. Down I dropped by the fire, and Mary said low to me, there's a letter for you. I put it on top of the books. Where from? I said. Yoda. Then I went up to my room and read it. I wanted to be by my lone self, you know, and oh dearie, it did me a great deal of good, that letter of yours. After the rain the other afternoon, when I was coming home with the men, we were out in the hills to the east of town, and the sun shone down through a break in the clouds on the blue hills to the west, all covered with mist. I wish you could have seen it. I don't know, but some way, Anna, everything I see that seems beautiful to me, I connect with you now. I wish we could be together. What comrades we would make. But never mind, there's a good time coming. Yes, Anna, I'm sure it will all come right if we keep on loving each other as we do now. But I must stop, or you think I'm getting sentimental after all. Anna, I hadn't ought to trouble you with my crude notions. But you see, I write just as I would talk if you were here, just as things come into my stupid head. I'm glad you like my queer letters. They are like no one else's letters at any rate, I guess. Write to me a long letter, anything, just so it's from you. This writing is cold comfort, but it's much better than nothing. I love you so much. Roy. One of Anna's first letters to Roy, she's decided she wants to become a teacher. And she's taken a very short teaching gig in the spring of 95. And in fact, she ends up then going to Winona Normal Teachers College in Winona. And this is her graduation picture from Winona Normal, looking like a school marm. So she's writing to Roy about her teaching. He's at Hamlin. She's in Dover, Minnesota. Dearest Roy, well, here I am on the third week of my school and still alive, the week half gone and nothing done yet. Tuesday was the worst day last week. I hope this will be the worst for this week, for I don't know what I should do if things were much worse than yesterday. I have a cold and am quite hoarse, and this was foreboding, of course. She gets sick. And as the children were very noisy, it was hard to talk, and that made me feel cross. And one girl had to stay after school. More ought to have stayed. They quarreled terribly, worse than you and Bowers. They threw glasses at each other, and one boy got a deep cut in his forehead. I washed it off and tied it up with my handkerchief. Then they fought some more. I stopped that. Then, as I am so unreasonable to forbid them to swear in English, they swore at each other in German. But today everything went well, and I am feeling lighthearted tonight. This has been a perfect day, and now in the early twilight, the air is so soft and it's so still that it makes me wish more than usual that you were here. We would take a walk, and it would all be twice as beautiful. Yes, we will try to have faith in ourselves, dear. If we sometimes lose faith in ourselves, we have faith enough in each other to keep up our courage. With lots of love, Anna. So February 18th of 1897, and Roy is dithering over a number of things. My dearest Anna. Now she's in Cloquet. He's at home in Arnoka helping his father. If you thought my letter before last was good, the next one was enough to antidote it, I bet. I'm sorry I sent it. I hadn't ought to write so untidily, and I beg your pardon. I'm glad you're feeling much better. You wrote me a while ago about something you read on friendship and people growing apart. I've thought of it too. Of course, love isn't tethered, and one always would love what the other was in the beginning. Still, I think people might grow apart having likings and new hopes and thoughts that the other one knew nothing of or cared nothing for. We will keep together all we can, won't we? Oh, we never will get far apart. I will try and come wherever you are, won't you? Perhaps you'll get higher than I can come. I know you're higher now in lots of ways, but women are better anyway. And I'll try and be a gentleman, dear, even if I'm not quite up to your standards. This is a crazy letter. May all things good be with you, with my dear love, Roy. One of Anna's last letters to Roy before she died. She died in December. This letter was written in October of 1898. She's teaching at Chatfield schools. Every time she went back to work, she got sick, and he worried about her, but he never said a thing to her to try to discourage her from her teaching. My dearest Roy, I felt well all week after being so sick. I hope I'm better. It makes me happy, dearest, to know you've been merry again. Your letter before sounded so blue. You were anxious about me. I read your letters just before the children come in the morning. It makes the day better. I do want you to write twice a week, dearie. You needn't be afraid I'll tire of your letters. I've been afraid to write to you too often for fear you would tire of answering. We will write as often as we must, for we are never going to be tired of each other if we live 1,000 years. Love, Anna. So I knew what happened to Anna. The epilogue in the book describes a lot about that. There were many newspaper articles about her death. She was very loved. And what happened to Roy? If some of you remember one of the last scenes in the movie Titanic, when they scan all the pictures of what Rose did during her life. She's an old woman now, and she learned how to fly, and she did all these things. That's kind of what happened with Roy's life as well. We know he was devastated. I've started reading the letters from 1899 on and all the letters between my grandparents. That's the next book, My Grandmother Lulu. But he was devastated, inconsolable. He did go back to school to study law, which is what Anna had wanted him to do. And I think he might have overcompensated. He participated in a nationwide national strongman contest and won. He beat out Amherst and Harvard and Stanford and all those schools. There's a picture in the book of him in 1901. The newspapers out east talked about the upstart from that little podunk town in Minnesota and how he had gone on to win this contest. And in 1904, he married my grandmother. By that time, he was almost 30, which was fairly old for men to marry in those days. And that's the next book. If you get your story down, and I can't emphasize that enough that you do that, you'll have many surprises. I did. The one about the photo that Krista found for me. Until 2 years ago, I had no photos of Anna. I had lots of pictures of my grandfather. And when Krista found this photo for us, I wept. It was wonderful to finally see a face on the person that I was transcribing her letters. And also, the Rochester Post-Bulletin did a story. They found out I was doing research on this book, published a story in the Rochester Post-Bulletin, and a gentleman named Bill Gardner from Rochester called the reporter and said, guess what? I know who Anna is. My great-great-grandmother was her stepmother. I have pictures of Anna. And Bill was the one who brought me this picture. And so we started a friendship talking about what his family remembered. He said the legend in his family about Anna was that she died the week she was to be married. And that was the first that I had heard of that. And then there were the spectacles. Sorry, I should have these out. I've had these little spectacles for decades. No idea whose they were. They're on the cover of the book. They were too small for my grandfather, and I knew they weren't my grandmother's. They didn't match her glasses. Of course, when I got the photo from Bill, I knew whose glasses these were. These little spectacles are probably one of the few things my grandfather had and was able to cherish after. And I can guarantee you will have surprises if you start writing your stories. So again, what story will be lost if you don't tell it? These are ordinary people. They weren't famous, and yet their story lives 120 years later. You have stories in your family as well. Ask your children and grandchildren, talk with your family, start getting those stories down. My book, Dearest Anna, A Love Story, is available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kindle. The History Center of Olmsted County has copies. Excelsior Bay Books has copies in the city. Thank you so much for letting me tell you my story, and go get started on your story.